Redditors who spend a lot of time in seclusion, at sea, in the air or out in the wilderness. What's the creepiest or most mysterious thing you've seen, found or experienced? I worked a heap of night shifts solo in the middle of the Australian outback as a driller up in Mount Isa. Usually I'd be down the bottom of 200 meters and open cut mine. One night I'm just sitting drilling away and I look down at my door light shining on something, and there, in the middle of the outback, at the bottom of a pit, is a crab. A little crab just walking around. Really blew me away because I had no idea how it would have got there, and we were about 1000 km from the ocean. Couple weeks after I found out they get sucked into the water table in Asia and pop out all over the world. Bloody fascinating. Hunting on Thanksgiving. 2015. I was at my in-laws' house for Thanksgiving in NW, Montana. They live about 60 miles south of the Canadian border. They are what I would call comfortable survivalists, and live way off the grid. No TV, no cell reception, too far up in the mountains for that. Great people, just don't like towns. My wife was homeschooled, you get the idea. I decided I would go for a morning deer hunt on Thanksgiving. It's a great location for it, as they are right in the middle of prime deer, elk, and bear country. Their house borders national forest land on 3 sides, so pretty easy to find yourself in the middle of nowhere, because you're already there. My Phil insists I leave the house at the butt crack of dawn. Where I hunt the deer don't start moving around until 8 to 9 am. But of course I agree with him and head out before light. I've got a headlamp on, walking down a narrow trail in thick coverage and can see about 10ish feet in front of me. It's super cold but no snow. Dark as heck. 20 miles from the nearest town. Phil says before I left that about 20-25 minutes hike you'll come to a small curved valley that is a newly finished logging project. Perfect area for deer hunting as there is minimal coverage and you can see about a mile down the valley. The trail meets up with a rugged logging road. As I keep walking I can start to see large slash piles from this logging project all over the place. I find a good spot over this little valley to sit and listen. As I'm sitting there and it's getting light, I'm looking all around me for deer. To my right about 200 yards away there is a slash pile with something moving on all around it. I pull out my little binus and look. There is a deer with its legs in the air, covered in dirt and blood. I start to feel the hair on my neck straighten out. The deer disappears inside the pile of branches and then I see a mountain lion come out from the pile, nose red with blood. He scrapes all around the area for a few minutes. I'm guessing he smelled or sensed me, because he was walking around in little circles and looking up in the air. I didn't know what the heck to do. I kind of panicked because they are very territorial and will definitely attack people. So me being the cool guy I am, fired my gun in the air and walked back to my in-laws' place in circles. I did see the lion run off, but still, that was the scariest walk I've ever been on. And of course played it cool when I got back. Told my wife what happened that night. We were out hunting with a group of guys. We were all about 100 yards from each other. The sun had set and darkness was quickly setting in. We called it a night and I started getting down out of the tree when I heard a twig snap. I froze thinking it was a deer and not wanting to scare it. After sitting for a few minutes this blood-curdling howl comes from where the twig snapped. We don't live in an area with wolves, like at all. We have coyotes, but they don't make the same sound. My phone started blowing up with the other guys asking if I'd heard it. Yep, it's nearly under my tree. It was so loud I could feel it in my chest. After about a half hour of silence I gathered all of my bravery. I bailed out of the tree, armed with the knife, and made my way to the group. We never saw it or heard it after that. It was one singular howl in an area that doesn't have wolves. On an island we've hunted for 10 years and never had anything like that happen. Still haven't quite figured out where it came from or what exactly it was. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I do environmental work and had to get access to go through this one landowner's cattle farm. Apparently he bought sick cattle on the cheap and if they lived he sold them. If not he would pile their carcasses in a waterlogged pit way in back of his property. I came across it by accident and saw several wild boar and coyotes run out from the pile. The smell was one of the most foul things I've ever come across. Oh yeah, the old offal pit. Anyone that's been around farms knows about those horrible places. I work on a research vessel, and in the North Atlantic around 2011 we saw some extremely bright object fly into the water. Not fall, but with a trajectory and no sound. It was blinding to look at and bright neon green, which illuminated the entire sky. It split the low-lying clouds like a sheet and continued to glow until it reached a depth where the light couldn't escape to our vantage point. Me and the other watchstanders all saw it, and there was much debate and confusion with no answers. The next night it was like we went into a bird portal. Literally all kinds of seabirds just in a confused tumult, smacking into our radars and falling from the sky. Even some that I wouldn't think could be out so far. Crap creeped me out to no end. I still tell the story from time to time as it is the most singular thing I've seen in a decade of sailing the deep sea. I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long abandoned town in the surrounding area. To get to as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over a creek 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye just ahead of me. There was a man, in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pajamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off all the alarms in my head nevertheless. He also wasn't wearing any shoes and looked well groomed, cleaned. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, nothing. He was just gone. Still rubs me the wrong way. The area I was in was a pretty rough hike, very secluded. Not very many people venture as deep as I was that day. No idea what was going on there. What was his riddle? I was doing some solo camping with my dog last weekend off in the wilderness. I was about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road, and probably about 40 plus miles from the nearest house civilization. I had set up a fire and was just chilling with my dog at about 8:30 p.m. when I heard tornado sirens. Basically that siren that plays in the Silent Hill movie around town. It was pretty loud too, and I was on edge for the rest of the night. It sounded a few more times throughout the night. It's eerie to be totally surrounded by the calming noises of nature and then hear that, especially when I am in an area that hasn't had any sort of tornado or severe natural disaster in a few decades. After returning, I did some research and I can't find anything about any warning sirens being in place in that area, nor could I find the source of the sound. I single-handed a boat from Mexico to North Florida. A few days into the trip, horrible weather, broken stuff and too many big ships around resulted in 54 hours without sleep. During the last part of that period, a high school girlfriend, a former co-worker, and I had a long conversation. Except they weren't there and I hadn't seen them in 15 years. Didn't actually happen to me, but I wanted to share a scary experience a friend of mine had. He was on a sheep farm in mid-February, staying in the old farmhouse which was situated in Tipperary Island, being paid to keep an eye on the ewes while they lambed. It's in the middle of nowhere and a long way from the nearest occupied neighboring farm. So as you do, he packed his shotgun and kept it close to his bed at night and allowed his trusty sheepdog Rocky sleep over his feet at the end of the bed. One night, he said it was 2 weeks into his watch, it happened. Being mid-February, it was cold as heck and nothing's colder than an old farmhouse with zero insulation. So he had 2 whiskeys before laying down for the night. Before he went to sleep, he checked his gun and patted Rocky. In the middle of the night, he said it was close to 3 a.m. he was woken by a strange animal cry, one which scared him bolt upright. Then there was a massive explosion and the window was burst out by a dark shadowy figure. He got such a fright he shat the bed there and then, hugging the blankets to keep himself safe. He later realized that the cry outside was a stag calling for a mate. The explosion was caused by him knocking the shotgun over and it going off, and the window exploding out was Rocky, who was scared shitless of guns to start with. When it went off, the poor sucker jumped through the window. I love how terrifying, yet totally mundane and explainable all this is. I was out turkey hunting. We had started hiking at night and had found our spots at about 4 a.m. I was roughly a quarter mile away from my hunting partner, shouting distance. It was pitch black, and we were trying to keep our lights off. I kept hearing human footsteps coming from almost random directions. After getting sufficiently uncomfortable, I heard a voice that sounded like it was maybe 10 feet behind me. Hey, lawless syntax. In my hunting partner's voice, I smelled the smell of coffee and Marlboro Reds. I replied sup but got no response. I flicked my lighter but didn't see anyone in the area. After saying that a couple times, I shouted for my hunting partner. He called back from what sounded like a quarter mile away. It started raining in the distance and heat lightning would occasionally illuminate the field. I saw a tree that looked like a human figure. After a few moments it wasn't there. More footsteps around me. After a while when the sun just started to faintly show, I decided to take a break and was getting a bit creeped out. So I walked the quarter mile to my hunting partner's tree stand to ask him what he wanted. He said that he hadn't left his spot and didn't walk up to me at any time in the morning. I've heard plenty of ghost stories about not replying to a voice that calls your name in the woods. Owl cruising through the trees silently at about 6-8 feet of altitude. I can see where that totally silent phenomenon would get mixed up with a ghost in your peripheral vision. Not that I spend a lot of time in seclusion, but one time many moons ago, an ex-girlfriend and I went camping at a spot that was halfway down a cliff. Not as dangerous as it sounds. It was kind of a secret spot that I know of and it doesn't get used a lot. The first night we were there I heard some noises outside the tent and a bit of rustling on the tent. But she was asleep when it happened and, in all honesty, I was too scared to investigate. I just laid there until I fell asleep. Neither of us were dead in the morning so I thought nothing of it until we came out of the tent and found a semicircle of about 10 rocks around the back of our tent. We didn't stay another night. Seeing what was left of a man lost at sea. We were too far offshore to report it to any governing body and what would they have done anyway? Just a bloated and sunburned torso bobbing on an endless horizon. Entrails dragging behind like jellyfish tentacles. And fish hanging out underneath, nibbling. For me, the creepiest part was that there was no mystery. We all knew what happened, more or less, and we all knew we could be that guy. I hunt a lot. My father has property in South Texas and I love going out there alone to spend a weekend and hunt. One weekend it was like mid-November and pretty chilly out. I decided I would head to my blind around late afternoon and stay there through the night. When I arrived to the blind I hadn't seen any animals on the way at all and we are talking a good 2 miles of walking and not seeing any birds or rabbits or anything. I didn't think anything of it since it was winter of course but you still see some birds. As I arrived to the blind I was setting everything up and pulled out this bottle of urine to try and lure a buck with. The moment I opened it I started hearing movement on this ridge back behind the blind and kept trying to look out the small windows and see if I could see anything. All of a sudden this loud thud hit the side of the blind. I jumped and thought maybe a deer had fallen off the ridge and hit the blind. I couldn't see anything so I opened the door and saw a huge rock and a nice dent in the side of the blind. Someone or something threw this rock which had to have weighed close to 30 pounds. I grabbed my rifle and said frick this most likely out loud, threw open the blind door, jumped the 6 or 7 feet to the ground and started running back to camp. Nothing else happened other than the fact that that night I didn't hear any coyotes yelping and howling at all which you always hear out there. I got in my truck and left the next morning because I didn't feel like getting stabbed by some junkie or attacked by no Bigfoot. Have only gone out there a few times over the last couple of years and never had another incident. Don't go often due to wild hogs infesting the area. Sorry for it being a jumbled mess. I am at work on my phone. It sounds like you were attacked by a wild trebuchet. A rare sighting indeed. Knew a guy that spent virtually his entire adult life homeless. Used to wander around all over the country and spent more than his fair share of nights sleeping in the woods with another homeless man he befriended while out in the streets. One morning he set off into town early to fetch booze and cigarettes while things were still quiet and not many people were around. His buddy stayed behind in their particular spot of the forest sleeping. These guys weren't too keen on being disturbed so they typically went fairly deep into the woods. A good 2 or so hours walk from town. It took him a good 4 hours to get to town. Buy his stuff from the offie, then lug it back to the spot where his friend was. When he finally returned he found his friend burnt alive inside his charred sleeping bag. In the 4-hour window that he left to get booze his friend was attacked while he slept in his sleeping bag and was set aflame by someone in the middle of the woods. Not me but my dad. My dad was stationed in Germany in the 80s in the US Army, and every 10 years or so they would do what's called a winter reforger, which was basically a giant game of war where two sides competed against each other. And my dad happened to be there during one. Him and a buddy operated a tank, but due to some complication, they needed reinforcements, so they had to stay put and wait. They got bored and walked to a small nearby town to get a bottle of applecorn, a type of alcohol. As they walked into town they saw a young boy riding a bicycle. They stopped him and asked him the nearest place to get a bottle, and he gave them directions. As they were following his directions they saw a bar with a bunch of people in it, but for some reason the kid didn't mention it, but they went in anyway. As soon as they walked in, everyone stopped doing whatever they were doing and stared at my dad and his buddy. Literally everyone, including the waitresses. After about 5 seconds everyone simultaneously started acting normal again, like nothing ever happened. A little creeped out, they asked to buy a bottle of applecorn. However, they refused to sell one to him, instead giving them both free shots of it. After this they kept insisting that they sit down to eat. They were passing around giant bowls of food and everyone would take some from the bowl and pass it to someone else. But my dad didn't want any food, they just wanted to buy a bottle of applecorn. But they kept refusing, only offering shots and food. Finally they got tired of it and left. As they were walking around looking for somewhere else to get the applecorn, they passed the young boy again and asked him about the bar and why they refused to sell them the applecorn. The boy turns pale and stammers, "You went to that place," and immediately cycles away as fast as he possibly can. My dad and his buddy look at each other like what the frick. Curious, they walk back to the bar to check it again. But when they get there, the bar is completely empty and the lights are off. They stare inside through the glass and the chairs are all upside down on the table with cobwebs everywhere. And the shelves behind the bar are completely empty and not longer stocked with alcohol. And they checked around the whole area to make sure it was the same area. And sure enough, it was the same bar where only minutes before had been crowded with people. They then found another bar and bought some applecorn and quickly got the frick out of there. To this day my dad and his buddy swear on it and say it's the creepiest thing they've ever witnessed. Experience the creepiest thing that they've ever witnessed. Process to find another bar, buy the applecorn, then get the frick out of there. Actually my heroes. I live near the criminally underrated North Woods of Maine. The creepiest thing I've seen out there is lights. Lights in the woods at night. On 2 occasions me and a friend approached them. They vanished when we got close. It was way off trail, in the middle of nowhere. No one had any business being out there at night. No one had any business being out there at night. And yet, there you were. Once when I was trekking through rural Finland alone, a stroll from the campsite, I decided to stop at a lakeside. I sat down by the lake in the moonlight, surrounded by trees, and felt very calm for a while. Splashed water on my face and generally refreshed myself. Then after spending some time looking at the water, I looked up and across the lake I saw a really tall figure, half as tall as the trees. It was really skinny and I'm pretty sure it looked like it had antlers or horns and really long fingers. Don't think it looked at me. I don't know if I was sleep deprived or something, but I remember I froze for a moment before running back to camp. I honestly remember seeing something. It was large and terrifying, but I was probably just tired and saw a trick of the light. I was in Oahu, Hawaii, hiking the Nuuanupali area with my boyfriend one afternoon. It was our first time there and our first time in Hawaii. We had chosen to hike that area because it was beautiful and heard that people see chameleons there sometimes. It was a beautiful hike. It was a very green rainforest with tall trees and bamboo. We decided to get towards the edge of the mountain towards the cliff, and that's when me and my boyfriend decided to split since we had the feeling we were getting close. I was alone hiking for probably about 30 minutes when I thought I heard somebody running through the forest in my area. I looked around and then the running sound was followed by silence. I didn't think anything of it, so I decided to sit down and take my GoPro camera out and mess with the settings. I was sitting in silence again when I heard leaves brushing through the forest as if somebody was running through it again. Then it sounded like there was more than one person running, and all I could think was, who chooses to run in a muddy steep forest right next to the edge of a cliff? And then the running stopped again and there was no one there again. I was alone, but I started to feel like there were many people staring right at me. It was starting to get uncomfortable and I got up and left the area to look for my boyfriend. I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds I heard of people running and why there was no one there. I googled the area and found out that many people had experienced the same thing I did. The sounds of people running through the forest. People believe they are the sounds of soldiers running through the forest before they fell off the cliff to their death in a battle that took place there in the late 1700s. I thought I was going crazy, but googling that place gave me chills. But why did you two go separate ways, lol? What a terrible idea. I hope someone sees this because I've been waiting for the perfect place to tell this story. Anyway, me and my friend, both 17, were hiking in deep forest looking for sheds, deer antlers. We were probably 5 kilometers back in the bush in the middle of nowhere when we heard the loudest, most textbook glass shatter I've ever heard. We looked for an hour but never found any sign of what make the sound. We finally let you shine and you leave us with 3 sentences. Welp, I guess not a bad 3-sentence read 10/11. I have experienced something like this in the woods of Portola Valley. I frequently camped by a stream, maybe 3-4 weeks total camping time if you add it up, and always there was the sound of the stream in the background, as well as gentle wind, boughs cracking and occasional animal sounds, little birds, crickets, you know, life. Well, one night I was woken up by a nightmare of a black greyish figure standing by our campsite, just standing there. It had no features. It was just a dark black color. I don't usually have paranormal fantasies or dreams, so this was very scary for me. It scared the crap out of me. So I woke up with a start. I wake up and then crap just feels wrong. I wake up my so and tell him I had a nightmare. As I am waking him up, I notice there is no sound. As in, 0 sounds of air moving, creak sound is gone, etc. And the entire campground, for which we were there alone, feels extremely oppressive, like heat with no heat. And I just have this feeling like we need to go, like now. I have never had a feeling like this since. The more I think about it now, the more creepy it feels. My so thank God was listening to me. He had some ghost experiences growing up and he noticed the lack of sound as well. And we pack up and leave probably in less than 30 minutes. That feeling of sticky, angry oppression didn't leave us until we were completely back in town. This is the stuff that's going to sound craziest. My car would not drive over 15-25 miles per hour all the way down the hill. No, it wasn't in second gear. No, we weren't high. My so and I tried everything, but I kept saying we need to get out now. As soon as we got to town, it went back to normal. I have no explanation for it to this day. I guess my story will be technically appropriate. On my last underway in the Navy, I was sitting sticks, basically driving the submarine. A couple weeks after we left Hawaii, everything is going smooth, and then sonar reports a contact. Turns out it was a Chinese fast attack submarine. Ended up following us for the better part of a day. Now, being in a hollow steel tube and understanding that at any moment you could turn into a mud dot is one thing, but that was a whole new level of stressful, especially considering we were much closer to Hawaii than Japan. My grandpa's story. He was an avid hunter, having thoroughbred coon dogs that won dozens of trophies each at dog shows. One day, he was out coon hunting through some woods on property that butted up to his house. As he walked across the cornfield coming closer to the tree line, he noticed something in the tree. He got closer and realized it was a freaking snowmobile, just hanging in the tree. He told me his first thought was, what kind of hillbilly mother? Anyways, he had a gun and 3 vicious butt dogs, so he wasn't too worried. He kept on walking and he came across an open-ended barn. No gables either side, in the middle of the woods. He said he walked through the barn and there were platforms on both sides of the barn, like stages, along with a bunch of neon painting throughout the entire structure. He then realized he had walked onto a haunted harried property in its off-season. Lived in the mountains and desert alone for 5 years in a camper. I found a very remote place, no trails or roads, that emitted a low frequency hum, so permeating that plugging my ears still didn't make it go away. It sounded like a B-52 flying right over my head, but nothing was ever there. I went back there a handful of times looking for gold and always the sound was there, about half a square mile of area. This won't sound like the spookiest story, but I experienced something really weird twice. This happened was when I went to visit very old church ruins in the forest. The place is kinda spooky itself. The trees are just huge, small trees are crooked, many oaks and moss everywhere because sun rarely reaches ground. You get it. Typical very scary forest, but you don't get bad vibes or anything. So I started walking near ruins and went down the steep road. After a while I realized that everything went silent. No wind, no sounds of birds, nothing. It was so eerie and weird. I wasn't afraid but felt like I shouldn't have been there. Still kept going and the sense was getting more and more intense until I finally stopped and stared one big half-dead tree in front of me and couldn't get my eyes off it. I felt hypnotized, like I was in awe with surroundings. When I could finally move I ran away back to the place. I haven't seen anything but I remember the weird feeling and silence. It wasn't a sense of dread, but I felt like I wasn't welcome and I needed to leave as soon as possible. No, you are not too late. No, your post will not be buried. Yes, your post will be read. With threads like these, those of us who love them will read each and every single story, even if the thread is years old. Just tell us your story. No need to preface or worry. Rural Maryland. Was walking around 11 PM with a friend through some fields, flying my drone, camping to get some videos at dawn. I am sitting there calibrating the drone to do a little circle when my friend taps me on the shoulder and points to the southern end of the field. Something huge, at least 9 feet, was walking toward us. Slowly though, it was parallelizing. All my life I'd always been terrified of encountering some kind of weird cryptid crap or paranormal stuff. I can assure you, it was no bear, it was no man. It was tall, skinny, and moving. And we got the frick out of there. I think this is the 4th story I've come across in this thread now involving this 9-foot thing, whatever it is. I was on a sub once with a couple of guys and a couple days, maybe a week into the journey, a boot appeared on a table. It didn't belong to anyone with us and wasn't put there by us. I spend a lot of my time hunting and fishing, so naturally I'm outside a lot. I was fishing the other night with my friend on his boat and I legitimately saw a UFO. I'm not saying it was aliens, but there was a floating orange orb in the sky which moved unnaturally fast and it did not have the shape of anything I have ever seen before. It made me a little uneasy the rest of the night. I used to see something similar all the time when I was a kid. At my parents' farm you'd see orange orbs coming from the southwest. They'd move fast and perform crazy stunts, sharp turns, loops etc. until they flew away to the knee. The house I was raised in had a gravel back patio. It was meant to be flagged but never got done, so was just loose gravel. Every morning my dad would go out and empty the bins. They were under my bedroom window. I sleep with my window open so would always hear my dad's footsteps on the gravel before hearing him empty the bins. Late one night I was playing on my PlayStation. I think it is Medal of Honor game. I had the volume turned right down for the sake of waking my family and the lights off. I was sitting there concentrating on the game when I heard the exact sound of someone walking across our gravel right under my window. I know the exact sound and I froze as soon as I heard it. I knew it meant someone was walking on our property. I was about 16 years old and was scared out my mind but didn't want to be a wuss. I remember pausing for a few seconds then jumping up and turning on all the lights as I sprinted downstairs. I hit as many light switches as I could as I ran to the kitchen, rear room facing back patio, directly under my bedroom. I turned on the lights for the backyard which were 2 strong floodlights. I stood face up against the glass and glared out the window looking for any movement. I was there for a good 5 minutes checking for any movement. Eventually I calmed down a bit and figured it must have been nothing. When I got back to my room I turned the last of the lights off and was just about to unpause my game when I heard the exact same footsteps but much faster heading straight back out. Whoever was there must have been hiding directly under the kitchen window I was staring out of the entire time. Freaked me the frick out. I didn't sleep a wink. Similar story from same house. Few years later when I was studying I would sneak out late at night for smoke breaks during assignments. My parents didn't know I smoked so I would be dead quiet and wouldn't make any noise as I snuck out for a smoke. One night I was standing there having a cigarette when I heard someone walking down our side alley. I freaked out thinking it would be a neighbor and hopped into the shadow of our patio doors which protruded from the kitchen. As I stood there watching the shadow of a figure emerge from my neighbor's side passage that is parallel with ours, I realized real quick it was not the silhouette of my neighbor and curiously stepped out of the shadow. The figure stopped and was obviously staring back at me. I was lit up from the lights of my kitchen, but the figure was in the dark. They would have been able to see me real clear glaring at them. They turned around and bolted. I ran back in the house and locked the door, then ran to the front door to check it was locked. I heard a car screech off as I did. Freaked me the frick out. If you want to see out windows at night, keep the indoor lights off and just turn on exterior lights. Whoever is out there won't be able to see you, but you will be able to see them. I was walking in the woods down a gravel road when I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I stopped in my tracks and took a few nervous breaths. I turned my head to the right and saw a big buck and two does standing about 10 feet away, staring right at me. I turned slowly and faced them and said, "Hey, are those your girlfriends? Are you taking good care of them?" We stood and stared at each other for about 15 seconds, and they slowly meandered away while I watched. I guess they didn't hate the way I smell. That was a nice day. In non-rural relative seclusion, I used to work at this large movie theater with 16 screens. I loved being the closing usher, where the last 2.5 hours of my shift when all the work was done and I would just be walking around killing time before the last show got out and I could leave. Once everyone had left, I had to patrol and make sure no homeless people were hiding in any of the auditoriums or restrooms. It happens infrequently. Walking around in an empty theater, I was used to the creaks and noises of such a large structure that never raised an eyebrow. However, every once in a while as I approached the bathrooms, I would realize that the motion sensor faucets were running. I would notice this about 10 feet away from the entrance to the restroom. Without fail, as I would approach the entrance, the faucet would stop running. There weren't any doors to the restrooms. They were designed so that there were walls and turns that blocked someone walking by from seeing into the restroom. There was no way that me beginning to enter the restroom would be picked up by the faucet, yet it consistently stopped as I entered. The restroom was always empty. Not really as spooky or interesting as some of these posts, but it's a mystery that I've never been able to explain. I haven't seen anything particularly creepy at sea, but there is something so unsettling about a really calm night. I'm talking zero wind, coming up on deck and seeing absolutely nothing but pitch black. You feel like you are literally in a black hole. It is incredibly surreal and hard to describe. It kind of feels like you're floating in a black abyss of space. The only thing you know is that your feet are on something solid, but other than that, really weird feeling. I spent 2.5 weeks backpacking in Olympic National Park. The weirdness happened about a week in. I say about because the memory and the timetable of events is a bit fuzzy. I remember that I had gone bushwhacking the day before. This game trail I'd been following started to widen a little, and by midday of the second day I reached an abandoned cabin. It had obviously been neglected for a long time. The roof was covered in moss and the wooden walls seemed to be suffering from rot. Some weather seemed like it was going to move into the area, so I thought I'd take a break inside. It had a musty smell like wet stone, damp crawl space, and rotting wood. Despite the smell, the cabin was quite spacious inside. Incredibly so, actually. There were 2 rooms, I remember, and a third door that went down a long, gently sloping stone tunnel that led down into what I assumed was a cellar. Looking back, I don't see how such a feature wouldn't have been visible from the outside, but there it was. I turned on a flashlight and started walking down. It went on for an impossibly long distance. I had gone about 100 yards, and my flashlight beam just faded into darkness when I shone it down the path ahead. This was not a cellar. There was a stifling, claustrophobic silence that seemed to press down on me the further I went. The darkness was disorienting, and I felt almost intoxicated. I'd probably stumbled on a pocket of poorly oxygenated air. Whatever it was, I'm glad I had enough sense left to nope the frick out of there pretty quickly. Here's the strange thing, though. I know I couldn't have gone more than 100 or 200 yards down that tunnel. I wasn't inside the cabin for even an hour, but by the time I got out of it was morning. I had spent the better part of a day inside. Needless to say, I backtracked and got the frick out of there. One night while flying a single-engine aircraft, I saw St. Elmo's fire on the prop tips. Precipitation static discharge, a sort of dim circular glow. I was solo backpacking in southern Ohio. I had stopped for a rest around 10 AM and I saw a weird shape a bit off trail. I walked over and it was a very basic shelter. Stick walls, a tarp roof, unopened cans of food, cloths, and a bed. The weird part was I was at least 20 miles from anywhere people might be, and about 10 miles to the nearest road. It looked freshly lived in, so I moved on. I still can't help wondering who might have set that up and was living there so far from anything. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.